Hi, I'm Mubanga and I'm developing a game where you build a town on a tiny planet that can be played in VR. In the first few episodes of this series, I showed you how I procedurally regenerate my worlds and how I added camera controls for both PC and VR. In the last video, I modeled a bunch of buildings and made sure that they fit nicely on the round surface of the planet. In this episode, I'm gonna implement a build system. This includes placing buildings on the surface of the planet, leveling the terrain, and destroying trees and buildings. In essence, I want to be able to place stuff on the surface of the planet. Stuff is the really good name for things like this, so I decided to call it an entity. Anything on the surface of the planet can be an entity, such as trees, people, buildings, resources, rocks, bushes, stuff like that. I know entities will share a lot of functionalities, but I also know there will be a lot of differences between entities. For example, you are able to construct buildings, but you are not able to construct villagers. But both of them are selectable. I could write a class for every single entity and define all of its functionalities in there, but that would require a lot of double work. Or I could write a main entity class and have subclasses that inherit from that and make specific changes to that for individual entities. But neither of those options sound really efficient to me. So I'm gonna take a component-based approach. Here I have modules with specific functionalities that you can drop in for your entities. For example, one of those modules is the deformable module that we talked about in the last episode. It makes sure that the building wraps around the surface of the planet. Another module that we'll be working on in this episode will be the placeable module. When attached to an entity, it allows the player or one of my generation scripts to place that entity on the surface of the planet in a static way and attach it to one of the nodes that we generated in the first episode. When a player is able to place a building on the surface of a planet, it needs a couple of extra functions. So in this case, I have another module that inherits from placeable called the buildable module. The final module that we will be talking about in this episode is the destroyable module. When attached to an entity, it allows that entity to be destroyed by the player. In the first video, I talked about how I spawn different trees for different biomes and give their leaves a random color. This kind of functionality would be good to be an entity module, so I can reuse it for other nature entities like rocks and bushes. So that's what I did. I extracted all those functions from the generation scripts and wrote them into a Biome Entity module. So now, if I want to have different rocks or bushes or something like that, depending on the biome, I just have to create one entity and drop this module in there. So one quick refactor later and everything is working again. No visual changes, but a lot has changed under the hood, which will make my life a lot easier. I created a build manager that keeps track of different build modes and delegates to other classes what needs to be done. The different modes are build mode, rotate mode, and destroy mode. The build manager has a function to start building by passing in an entity. The build manager itself doesn't do very much. It's more of a pass-through for other classes. For example, when build mode is started, it will tell build preview to activate, which will then spawn an entity which will leverage its buildable component to figure out if it can be built in the current build position, and tell the build preview to start rotating or finish building. When either of the three build modes is active, the build manager will update the build position. It does this by getting an array from the input manager. Array is basically a line from one point with a certain direction that checks until it hits something else, in this case the surface of the planet. If you watched episode 2 of this series, you know there are two input managers, one for the PC controls and one for the VR controls. The array the PC control manager gives is based on the screen position of the mouse. The VR controller draws a ray from the hand in the direction the player is pointing. After getting that ray and checking if and where it intersects with the planet, the build manager will then tell either the build preview or the destructor, which we will talk about later, to update their position. So let's take a look at the build preview, shall we? The build preview temporarily creates the thing that needs to be built as a child of itself. This way, the entity and the build preview move together. It will then check every frame for the node closest to the current build position. The build preview will then move to the target node and orient itself away from the surface of the planet. It will then do some stuff regarding rotation, which we will be talking about later in this video, and asks the buildable module to check if it can be built in that location. This is another case where the modular approach really shines, because not all buildings will be able to be built in the same positions. Take for example this dock. We could have another module that inherits from buildable that we call, for example, buildable on coast. And it checks to see if the part that we want to be on the land is on the land and the part that needs to be in the water is in the water. However, we aren't there yet. We are currently looking at the default buildable module, and that has the following criteria. It needs to be above water, so have an elevation above 0. The main node and all the subnodes cannot be occupied. The main node is the node that's usually in the middle of the entity, and the subnodes are all the other nodes that the entity overlaps. I get these by using a physics overlap box. This will allow us to have buildings that overlap multiple nodes. The check will not only return if it can be built, but also a list of entities that are currently blocking it from being built. So after that I can show which entities are blocking it by turning them pink, and show if you can or cannot build the current entity by turning it blue or red. In build mode, when the player presses the primary button, which is left mouse click on PC, and the right trigger in VR, the player enters rotate mode. The entity will stay in place, but will rotate towards the build position. To achieve this, I wrote an extension method for the vector tree in Unity that allows me to rotate around a certain axis. In this case, the normal towards the center of the planet, which is handy because in my case that's also the origin, so that it's just the position where you're trying to build. While in rotate mode, the build entity continuously checks itself to see if it's still valid in its current orientation. If the build position and the rotation is valid, and the player presses the primary button again, the entity gets placed. This means it gets detached from the build preview and added into a container with all the other buildings the player placed. The position and the rotation are then definitively set. The buildable entity then gets the subnodes one last time, as well as the area nodes, which is another set of nodes that are in a sphere around the entity that are used to smooth out the terrain a little bit. The entity gets restored to its original material colors, and then finally all the nodes are set. That means the main node gets flagged as a main node, and both the main nodes and the subnodes get flagged as occupied. We then also store a reference to this entity, so that we know which entity is occupying this node if we ever need it for gameplay reasons. So to smooth out the terrain, we do that in the terrain manager that we created in the very first episode of this series. As the name implies, it's responsible for generating and updating the terrain of the planet. I wrote a method for it that takes in a main node, a list of hard nodes and a list of soft nodes. The hard nodes get set to the same elevation as the main nodes, and the soft nodes get the average elevation between that node and the main node. So in the case of placing buildings right now, I use the subnodes as the hard nodes and the area nodes as the soft nodes. We keep a reference to the old elevation for the case when you want to reset the terrain, for example when you delete a building. Then we apply the new mesh to the terrain mesh and we have this nice smoothed out terrain around our building. I also created a method that resets the elevation of a group of nodes, which will be called when you delete a building. Back in the build manager, we have a function that's called start destroy mode, which activates the destructor class. The destructor is very similar to the build preview. It's attached to an object that's a child of the planet, and it also gets the build position from the build manager class that I get from the raycast. While destroy mode is activated, it finds the closest entity with a destroyable module attached to it, within a sphere around the build position. It will then turn that entity red to show which building will be destroyed, and then when the player presses that primary button again, the nodes associated with that entity get reset, meaning they are no longer occupied and they remove the reference to that entity. Then the terrain gets reset as well, like I showed a second ago. And finally, the destroyable module will destroy the entity and the game object itself. I think that about wraps it up for this episode. I started work on a modular entity system. I created a system to place, rotate and destroy buildings, and added functionality to smooth out the terrain. It is a lot of fun to see this project come along. And it is really satisfying to be finally able to place these buildings on the surface of the planet, both in PC and VR. However, I don't really have a good way of choosing which building I want to place right now. I actually have to drag an entity prefab to the build manager in the inspector to select another building. So it's about time I started working on a UI, something we will do next episode. So subscribe to stay up to date on this project and leave a like if you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching. Bye.